Beautiful. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, again. Yes, who was here for cultural burning talks? Look at that, Unc. Lovely. So, welcome back, and also welcome to everyone else. We're on the lands of the Wathaurong peoples. So I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. My acknowledgement is the sacrifices they made and the paths that they forged for all of us Australians. My name's David. I was born on the block in Redfern. That's in Sydney. The City of Sydney Council adopted the term invasion, ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday, you know what that day was. I'm a glass half full man. Been involved with Rainbow for many years now, and been involved at the City of Sydney where not Captain Cook, Lieutenant Cook didn't discover Australia, he circumnavigated parts of it. There's truth-telling. So my cultural contract, my job, is how we bring back a narrative that is not a reductionist narrative, that is not continually referencing us in the past tense, that isn't paternalistic and patronising and condescending. And when you remove those very covert and powerful narratives, the laws of nature, you need to replace that. So at the City of Sydney, we are doing that through excellence, contributions, achievements, aspirations, the dreaming, prosperity, all those words you never used to hear in the same sentence. It's an honour for me. I also just want to acknowledge elders, Uncle Ben, Juanita, Uncle Phil, my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, and also any other Indigenous brothers and sisters from around the world, but also equally as importantly, all my fellow Australians. This is a very powerful conversation. This is a beautiful spirit. It's an honour for me to sit beside Uncle Bruce and introduce. We've got you for an hour and 30, I think it is. What we're going to do is open up the floor about 3 o'clock, so it's in 45 minutes for Q&A. So we just ask if something piques your interest, lock it in, and we'll open up the floor for questions and answers later on. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado from me, I'd like to introduce a very special human being, Uncle Bruce Pascoe.
Thank you, my brother. I'm about the most ordinary person I know, so forget most of what you just heard. The circumstances of my life meant that I was forced into a consciousness that I wouldn't have achieved on my own, because my grandmothers and my mother in particular were directing the way I thought, and it was just the accidents of history which meant that I was able to talk about these things because they were thrown at me by the old people. And so if it's anyone's fault or if it's anyone's achievement, it belongs to those old people. My family are Bunurong, which is the group surrounding Port Phillip and Western Port Bay. Most of my family were born on Bunurong country. We have Bunurong family connections as well. We're Panalapana from northern Tasmania. We've got family connections there from both sides of our family. We've got Yuin in our family as well, South Coast, New South Wales, and I currently live on the very southern end of Yuin land on the Regrowing River near Malakuta, and living on that country is a very special feeling. When you look around the festival site, as Vicky was saying as we drove in, this country will need healing in its own right once all the cars have gone, once all the feet have gone, once all the activity is gone. This country will need to be repaired. Every time we step on the earth, we have to think about how we're going to repair it, how we're going to look after Mother Earth. Australian Aboriginal people across the continent and on the islands refer to the earth as our mother. We're not the only people around the world who think of the earth as our mother, but it's not just a truism. It's not a motherhood statement. It's about caring for the earth and making sure that the earth is in a condition where we can live on her and take advantage of her benevolence toward us. And if we don't look after the earth that we're on, then we will find ourselves without one. And that is the worst possible outcome of our own activity, of everything that we do. We have to be so careful of what we do. But if you can imagine this country, which is currently hammered by sheep and cattle, and people blame drought, but this country looked different 230 years ago. More or less the same climate, but it looked different because the soil was so fine you could run your hands through it because of the crops that were grown, the care that was taken of it, and the fact that sheep hadn't been running around for 230 years hammering the ground into baked submission. We allow hard-hoofed animals to roam free on a land that had never had hard-hoofed animals before, and then we're surprised that the soil conditions are different. None of us learned about this at school, so Australia wasn't prepared to look after the earth. Now that we know that Aboriginal people had an agricultural economy which was based on care of the earth, which was using domesticated plants, but was looking at a tomorrow where the conditions for growth and production would not diminish, then we would be so much more careful of our earth. Because since the colonial days, the productivity of this soil here has plummeted. And it's plummeted because of bad land use. And the way that people still get a return from the land is by pouring on more and more chemicals for to produce that boost in plant growth, more chemicals to destroy the pests that want to eat those European plants, more chemicals to drench sheep and cattle. More and more chemicals is the response, not more and more care. And if you read a book by Bill Gammage, talks about how to care for country, how to look at country. It's a really worthwhile book to read. Another book by called The Cry of the Reed Warbler by Charlie Massey talks about rejuvenating land that has been hammered by overuse. Too many hard hoofs galloping across that country and hammering it so hard that it's impenetrable to the moisture that comes as rainfall, where rainfall runs off as a flood rather than penetrating the soil. We in Australia have abused this soil for 230 years, and now is the time to recognise Aboriginal achievement, not the achievement of wise and beautiful people, but the achievement of people who looked closely at their country and revered the earth as their mother and determined to do no harm. And if we followed those principles, where everything we did was designed for the enhancement of Mother Earth rather than its degradation. Yesterday, I was in a forest a couple of 100 from here, and it wasn't a forest at all, really. It was a blue gum plantation, and all the trees were exactly the same age, exactly the same height, exactly the same species, and in amongst them were these giant red gums, these poor, lonely, giant red gums. And the operator of that plantation was taking machinery right up to the very base of those old trees that had been preserved because of some court order, presumably, but no respect at all, no respect for those trees. And so there they are, the poor, lonely things, separated from their brothers and sisters by this plantation of blue gum. It is a really devastating sight. At least half the trees are dead because koalas are eating out the whole tree. Koalas have a brain which is approximately that big, and they think with half of it, and all they do is eat. And eat and eat and eat. They're killing those trees. It's not the koala's fault. The koala used to have more of these trees. Now there are fewer of these trees and more of them. It's like the earth itself. There are more of us and fewer resources like water, and so collapse is almost impossible to avoid. And of course, the people who suffer in an economic collapse, in a resource collapse, are always the poor. Not the rich, who will have the resources to avoid it, but the poor. And we should be really arguing with our governments, arguing amongst ourselves, how can we avoid this economic and environmental collapse? And the reason why it's important to speak at an event like this is because if change is going to happen, it's going to happen from here. My generation aren't going to help you. Don't wait for that to happen. Don't clap the demise of the elderly. Some of them are top people. No, but it's true. My generation and the generation before and the generation before that are the people who invented things which were there to exploit the earth rather than to look after the earth. So we have to ask ourselves, and we have to generate the solution out of groups like this. It's not going to come from elsewhere. Don't wait for the Labor Party to do it. Don't wait for the Liberals to do it. Don't wait for the Greens to do it. We have to create the movement and then give it to the politicians, whoever those people are. We give it to them. Don't sit around waiting for them to invent it. They're not going to. They've had plenty of time and they haven't done it. We have to invent the solution which saves the earth, looks after its heritage and looks after its cultures. It was mentioned before that saving the cultures of the earth is a great way of saving the earth itself. And that is true. People who have been in a position for a long time to observe the earth and to observe its changes and to observe those things which help preserve it, they are the cultures which have something to offer in our current dilemma. Aboriginal people have been on this country for at least 100,000 years, probably longer. And I don't say 100,000 years airily, because down at Warrnambool, not so far from here, there's a midden which has been tested at 80,000 years. That's on the very south of the continent. 80,000 years. The out of Africa theory says people left Africa 70,000 years ago. This is an old continent. Ours are an old people. And not everything we do is full of wisdom and grace. But over 100,000 years, you get a long time to think about it. And the thing about our old people and our culture was that a long time ago, those old people sat down and started to organise solutions, political solutions, social solutions, environmental solutions, and economic solutions to the problem of being human. Just those problems that afflict humans. And those old people, over we don't know how long, but over a long period of time, the men and women sat down, argued amongst themselves, worried over the solution, went to bed worrying, woke up worrying, and gradually over a long period of time wrought a system where everybody got fed, everybody had a house, and everybody took part in the culture, and where nobody had the right to fight a war for land. These were unique circumstances. These were a unique people. And it was all done not for the benefit of a prince or a king or a queen or an army or a god. It was done for Mother Earth herself. Not some esoteric being, the earth, the visible God of the earth. And so those old people came up with this mighty solution. And as we look around these hillsides, try to look past the earth in its current predicament and think back to when those old people were looking around these hillsides and where these old people were communicating along song lines to people who lived in East Coast jungles up in the north. And they were communicating with people who were living in the red deserts in the centre. And they were communicating with people who lived in Broome. All those people communicating together and all coming to the conclusion that they would not fight each other for land. It's a remarkable thing. I can't emphasise enough how remarkable that intellectual grunt to come up with a solution where it is best not to fight. Because the easiest thing on earth is to fight. Our whole political system is based on the adversarial system of Western law, where you fight, and there are winners and there are losers. Politicians, sporting commentators speak gloatingly about the winners and the losers, rather than speaking respectfully about all of us equal. This is not a political paid broadcast. It's just, we're talking about the earth itself. We're talking about the possibility that people could have their culture and have a healthy earth at the same time. And if you think these are just platitudes, then go back to the history that your school teachers never taught you. And I was in a situation where I was talking to friends at my own kitchen table, good people, good friends, and we were sitting there eating the food that had just come out of the river, and I was talking to them about the ideas I had for the book Dark Emu and what I was learning about the old people's wisdom. And my own friends were saying, oh yes, but. Because they couldn't believe that a culture on earth could conduct itself for 100,000 years without warfare. They couldn't believe that Aboriginal people had a system of agriculture. Why couldn't they believe it? Because they'd never heard it from a teacher. So if you're in any doubt about that, read Lieutenant Gray's journal. But don't read the facsimile, read the original. Go online and read the original. Because in the original, Lieutenant Gray in Western Australia, the first European on country, comes to a vast landscape which had been altered by Aboriginal people who had been tilling the land as they cultivated yam and harvested yam, and the ground had been so deeply tilled that he couldn't walk across it. This is your Australia. And in your education, you never heard that word tilled being applied to Aboriginal people. Charles Sturt was saved in the so-called dead heart of Australia by people who were feeding him with roast duck and cake. Roast duck and cake in the very hardest conditions of Australia, the kind of conditions that our writers, Henry Lawson, Ian Idris, and those really good writers, no doubt about it, they could write, they could tell a story, but they were trying to say that Australia was the hardest continent on earth. You know, that you had to be a man's man in Australia to survive. And here were these pussy Aboriginal people living on roast duck and cake. How soft. And yet they were doing this in the dead heart. And you didn't read that in your school curriculum. You weren't taught that, and yet your history teachers didn't read it either, because history teachers before them read those explorers' journals and decided that those bits of information were not to be read to Australian students. Who was it decided that when they observed that Aboriginal people were tilling and tending the great fields of Bunurong around the city of Melbourne, contouring the land in their production techniques, that fact would never reach Australian students? Was that just a bad judgment of an educationalist making the wrong decision about what to include in the curriculum? Or was it a political judgment? Anyway, people long before I went to school, long before you went to school, were not actually reporting the history of Australia, the colonial history of Australia. They were reporting some kind of myth that had been created by politicians and by the churches of Australia. Because the first thing churches in Australia did was to try and take culture from us, try to take language from us. Not satisfied with taking the land, wanted to take the culture and the language as well. So your education, I'm afraid, my education, was sadly undervaluing the country that you live on, your country. And a lot of the decisions that have been made, removal of children, assimilation, the intervention, the knocking back of the Yorta claim on country, because the history had been washed away by the tide of history. All of those decisions have been made on the premises that Aboriginal people didn't deserve to live on the land. That Aboriginal people might have been wise and beautiful, but did not actually farm the land, and therefore, in the eyes of a farming culture, didn't deserve it. And that is a myth. That is a myth that you can disprove simply by going into any public library, going online, stay in the comfort of your own home, have your own cup of tea, sit in a chair, go donk, 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 and Dr. Google, Uncle Google will show you that the education about Australia that you had was totally inadequate if we are to deal with the facts about our country, to deal with the hammered hillside that I'm looking at over there now. Why is that ground so poor now when Oxley and Sir Thomas Mitchell and people rode through this country, the grass was higher than their saddles? How come we can see the bones of this earth's arse sitting up there now? how come we have treated this country so badly that we think that is a farm. There's a lot can be done. I recommend Charlie Massey's book again. It's about rejuvenation of buggered farmland. And of course I recommend Dark Emu, which now is only $20. And I haven't got any because, yeah, there's one here. But it's something we can do. Looking after country is something that we can all do. You know, I notice that the recycling here is pretty stringent. That is something that we can do. Looking after this earth once all the cars are gone is something we can do. Preparing to grow perennial grains, perennial crops is something we can do, because if you're growing perennial grasses, perennial tubers, then you're not ploughing the land. So there's a saving of tractor hours, diesel consumption, all of these things, while sequestering carbon, because perennial plants sequester carbon. And, you know, when this government of ours, be it Liberal or Labor, they've both had a crack at it and both failed to do it so far. When a government in this country decides that there is something that humans can do about climate change, then the first thing and the easiest thing to do is to replace annual food crops with perennial food crops. It'll sequester carbon. The yields won't be as great. So if you read the Weekly Times in 18 months' time, you'll see that the chemical companies will be saying, oh yes, but they can't get the yields that we get. No, we'll never get the yields that chemical-driven farmland will, but we'll do so without destroying the earth itself, and we'll do so cheaper. Farmers already thanks for that applause for Mother Earth. Farmers already are dispensing with the chemicals, and they're growing perennial crops, and they are making money, because their greatest cost above equipment is chemicals, and most of those chemicals destroy the soil. They produce growth, but they destroy the soil, and the soil is the heartbeat of any farm. So if over generation, over generation, over generation, you're destroying soil, eventually you're going to hand to your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren dust. That's what's happening here. We have to be more careful of our earth. I'm just about done there, Bros. There you go, caught you on the hop.
Oh, jeez. Oh, hello. Is this mic on, folks? Can you hear me there? Got any level on that one? Yeah. Can you hear me out there? You all right? Yeah? Okay. Look, if you're in the hot sun there, come on up here, folks. There's plenty of room up here. Don't worry, I'm not going to stage dive. You might. So, I've got a question. I've got two questions. I've got lots of questions. But the first one is, you mentioned you were sitting around your table with your family, talking out the concept of dark emu. Can I ask what led you to that? And also, what is dark emu? And then the third question is, what's next?
Well, second question first, because I've forgotten the first one. The dark emu, when I was thinking about writing the book, I was talking to a lot of Australians, mainly young people, about these concepts, and their lecturers, this is actually the answer to question one. A lot of their lecturers approached me later on over the coming months and said, look, you're talking about Aboriginal agriculture. There was no such thing. You know, you're telling lies to our students. This is an educational institution, happened to be university in Canberra, nation's capital, and they said, we don't want you lying to our people. And at that point, I knew that if I couldn't convince 6 of the best educated people in Australia that this had actually happened, how was I going to convince the truck driver and the checkout person and the swimming pool instructor? How was I going to convince those people if 6 of the best educated people in Australia couldn't believe that Aboriginal people had an economy, an agricultural economy? And so that's why I then turned exclusively to the explorers' diaries, because the explorers, the Australian explorers, get their heads on stamps, on coins. They're revered because their truth was gospel. What they said was gospel. You couldn't argue against it. So by using the explorers' journals, even people like Keith Winshuttle and John Howard had nothing to argue against, because they had already extolled the words of those explorers before. They had uplifted the explorers' observation to the very truth. So by using the words of those explorers, the observations of them are incontestable. And, you know, it'd be wonderful for me if people from here would go back, would go online and read those journals, because it's all there. It's available for any Australian, and you deserve it. It's your country. It's your country that is being buggered up by people who do not love it. So it's our responsibility, if you love Mother Earth, to care for her. And you will see that the first entries in the country, the first Europeans in the country, saw Aboriginal people involved in highly complex agricultural systems. And I didn't want to call the book a treatise on the early stages of incipient agriculture in the Australian landscape, because no one had read past the title. That's the title invented by someone looking for a PhD. I wanted to call it something about the land. And in looking for something about the land, of course, I looked into the sky, because everything on Earth is replicated in the sky. That's what our old people believe, eh? And because our old people were exposed to the sky. We were never far from the sky because we slept under her. And in the sky, in what we call the Milky Way, you will see not stars, but a dark shape. And that dark shape is an elongated emu. And that elongated emu changes shape as the seasons pass in Australia. Once you are able to identify the emu in the sky, watch that emu change, because in the egg-laying season, the legs of the emu come up underneath him as he guards the eggs. She lays the eggs, he guards the eggs. And you can observe this. This is your country. You don't have to talk about Orion. You don't have to talk about, Scorpio. You've got your own country's culture there in the sky to be read. And, my people are black duck. Southern New South Wales are black duck. Right at the moment, I can see the black duck. And it's a wonderful thing to be on country, look up, and there's the black duck. There's the spirit of your country looking right at you. I don't have to talk about Orion and Pleiades and Scorpio and Venus. If I was a Greek or a Cypriot, I could talk about those things because they're my stars, they're my stories. But this country has a different story, because the people who lay under those stars for 100,000 years had stories to tell about them, and most of the stories are environmental. about looking after country, about looking after each other. Very close to here, there are two mountains, there are two brothers who fought and fought and fought, were jealous of each other, and fought and fought and fought, and they were turned into stone. They're the only two mountains on that great plain close to here, and the lesson is cooperate with each other. It's a simple message of care and hope. Cooperate with each other. Do not fight to the death over anything. Fight for life. And it's a great yarn. Brother John Clark told me that yarn decades ago when he was a young man. And I'll never forget it, because as he was telling it to me, he was just pounding inside me. That is the way. It's always the way with our people of peace. Peace. And when our mobs fight each other, I think the old people would be disgusted with this, because our old people talked with each other, talked and talked and talked, and refused to fight. Even if there was no visible resolution, they would not decide on anything until everybody had come to agreement. I'm not in a position to talk about that to any great extent. There are elders here today who can yarn to you about that. I can only suggest it, but it's something to think about. And when you look at Dark Emu, when you look at the country, when you look at the mountains, when you look at the rivers, think about that. Think about this road to peace. What was the third question, brother?
What next, Dunk?
What next? Well, we're growing the first crops of Bunurong. Not the first crops, there's plenty of people growing Bunurong at the moment. But they're the first crops on our land down in Yuin country. We've got the first crop of panicum, which is the grass that saved Charles Sturt's life. Everybody knows about Charles Sturt, everybody knows about Burkewills, but nobody knows about the grain that saved his life. And so we're trying to regrow those grains. We've got a crop of kangaroo grass, we've got small quantities of grain, and we've already cooked the first bread made from kangaroo grass flour in 230 years. And the old ladies of Lake Mungo, north of here, they were determined to harvest their panicum grains and turn them into flour. So for those old girls who saw that bread come out of the oven 4 years ago with tears in their eyes, had done something miraculous. They had recovered the truth about their own food, and the truth about that food is that grass grows in sand. It needs one watering a year, which is the autumn rain, and then it grows in sand. This is something to know about our country, something to inspire us to care for our country, because these are grains that don't need chemicals, don't need a shitload of water, don't need fertiliser, don't need pesticide, and don't sterilise the soil. They encourage the soil, they work with the soil. These are fantastic things for the country to have. And what next for me is growing these foods, but what I ideally want to do is get in a position where we can show that these things are possible, and then I just want to give it to young Aboriginal people. I want young Aboriginal people to buy the bricks and mortar for their house, buy the kids' school books, the kids' school shoes, or whatever it is they've got to buy, the white Toyota, because that's part of our dreaming, the white Toyota dreaming. Buy those things on the back of their own traditional foods. So they're working in their culture as a modern citizen, doing the things that modern people do, but with this profound backing of the old people, because they've returned to caring for Mother Earth. That's that's my ambition. And a man as old as me, his ambition is pretty limited because there's nothing to be gained. I've got 2 dogs, I've got 2 cars, I've got 2 boats. I don't need anything else. Like, how can you bribe a man like me? There's nothing to do, because I'm so lucky that I want for nothing. But what I do really want is I want my young people to live a better life than their grandparents had to live. And I believe it's possible. And you people, non-Aboriginal people, have a role to play because you could create the conditions for that to happen. Because a little story, abalone, when abalone, which had been derided as mutton fish, this is the shellfish from southeast coast of Australia, west coast, when that shellfish had a market in Japan and China, it suddenly became an industry. The only people not to get licenses in that industry were Aboriginal people. In the, pardon me, in the 1930s, during the Depression, when the last person in Australia to get a job was black, Aboriginal people were destitute. But most people on the East Coast survived on abalone. It's a sacred shellfish for us. You could talk to people who ate abalone every day because that was all they had. And that survived them. So the position of abalone in Aboriginal culture now, koodaroo, as Wathaurong people would say, it's kind of verging on godlike because it came for the people at a time when they desperately needed it. But as soon as it had a monetary value, it was whipped away from us. One of my nephews is in jail now for poaching his people's traditional food. And, I'm sure there are law students here. Now, you don't have to embarrass yourself by identifying yourself because no one wants stones thrown at them. Yeah, good on you, brother. But I think of the judge who sentenced that young man to 7 years jail for poaching his traditional food. And I think of that judge, a learned man, highly educated, highly respected, thoughtful man. You don't get to be a judge without having this great weight of Western culture behind you, and which you've shown enormous proficiency in, without that ability to learn in the Western way. But that judge didn't know his Australian history, because that judge looked at that man and said, he has stolen something. But if that judge knew his history, the judge would say, no, he's stolen nothing, because that lad's father survived only on abalone. And that lad grew up thinking that the abalone was his food. So how can he steal it? That should have been the judgment. That judgment should have been. So when these issues arise, and they will arise again, when a Prime Minister says about the statement that came out of Uluru this time last year, when the Prime Minister says it is too ambitious, and read the statement and find out where the ambition is, because it's a statement of hope. It's not a statement of greed, a statement of belligerent claim. It is a statement about the earth. How can care of the earth be too ambitious? So when those things come up again, you march on Parliament House. But I'm wearing William Cooper's shirt. Here's for William Cooper. This is something to really cheer about. William Cooper, when Jews were being persecuted in Europe in the Second World War, one of the first Australians, one of the few Australians to object, marched on Parliament House, and he was black. He was William Cooper. He marched on Parliament House in defiance of his government, and he did so before most Australians showed any objection to Jewish people being incarcerated. So this festival is actually on William Cooper's country too.
Wow, that's so powerful. And respect to William Cooper and his family and also his legacy. I just want to unpack something you touched on there, and as I did promise to those who are new to this amazing audience, we are going to take our questions. So just got a quick show of hands. Who's got a question? Not too many. Cool. Okay, great. So, yeah, we won't do it right now. So, the question I wanted to ask you when you touched on intellectual property and, you know, setting up a future for the next generation. I mean, technically, that's about patents. It's about setting up governance and infrastructure if you want to channel that sustainable revenue to the next generation. Am I making sense there? How does that look to you, rather than Monsanto or others who are going to appropriate what you have uncovered with those elders?
Well, a lot is said in Australia about closing the gap, about making sure that Aboriginal people have employment opportunities and training. And what I've witnessed of that is that Aboriginal people get training certificates as long as they're armed, but they don't get a job. Unemployment in Australia is 5% at the moment. So it ought to be possible for an increasing Aboriginal employment base rather than a decreasing one. So when we're speaking platitudes about closing the gap, here is an opportunity to do it. Make sure that this billion-dollar industry, which will be Australian native grains, Australian native tubers, this billion-dollar industry, when Coles come knocking on the door and realise that this tsunami of environmental awareness is demanding these foods which are good for the soil, when that tsunami hits, I want Australians to stand up and say, hang on, people are making billions out of this industry, it's good for the earth, but where are the Aboriginal people who domesticated these plants? Where are they in the industry? And my ambition is not that non-Indigenous people are prevented from growing these grains. It'd be stupid to try, but it would be intelligent to make sure that Aboriginal people are part of the industry and that young kids become involved in this agriculture, have the opportunity to go to university, to study the environment, to study horticulture, those things. This is a way of achieving what so far has just been a platitude. My uncle, he had a question, brother. Yeah.
You got another radio mic there, ladies? Or, yep, you want to take this one? Okay, take that one. All right, so Uncle Bruce, allow... hang on, you take that one, yeah. Sorry. Uncle Bruce, allow me to introduce actually another very dear uncle, Uncle Phil Bly. And I seek a lot of solace and counsel in his wisdom, and he's got some questions.
Just one, Uncle Bruce. Thanks very much for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us today. Really grateful and appreciative of that. Look, maybe we need to change our thinking to the survival of the most cooperative rather than the survival of the fittest. Just the one question though, and because I think it sort of strikes at the heart of you know what's happening in Australia today in terms of who controls the power here, who are the marionettes that are pulling the strings. Is when you go and deliver your message around Australia and perhaps other places as well, do you get any pushback from academics and politicians, and what is the nature of that pushback? You know, where is it coming from?
Thanks, my brother. I appreciate what you've said. There hasn't been much pushback. I think I touched on it before. It was more or less accidental. It was forced on me by the criticism I received from those ANU academics. They forced me into searching for a way of communicating this in a way where it couldn't be so easily contested. It was the Explorers journals. So there hasn't been much pushback. I've been condemned by Andrew Bolt, but I
want to just tell, we get a lot of international visitors here. You might just want to say who he is, eh?
Andrew Bolt's a right-wing journalist. People say he works for the enemy, but he's just a fellow who makes a living out of doing the service of his right-wing industrialists. And, to be condemned by Andrew Bolt is the highest compliment.
Other question there somewhere? Another question? Anyone else had a... yeah. All right. And anyone else? Just if you've got a quick... Okay, we eyeball you to there. Yeah. No.
Thanks, Bruce, for everything you've done, mate. And I think your story's been amazing. Just quickly, with the amount of people that are here now listening, myself included, I'm sure there's a lot of us that probably have land available to sort of contribute to that space. Is there a way that we can contribute that land and get some originals on there to farm it and create an industry from here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm approached by a lot of farmers who want to do the same thing, who have got land available, can see the writing on the wall in terms of global warming, the reduction in moisture levels in their soil, and so they're looking for a way to go forward. People think of farmers as being the most resistant and reactionary groups, but good farmers actually know their soil and care for their soil, care for the land. And so I find that the farmers are the ones who are quickest to understand the argument. And so seed is very hard to get now. You can get Bunurong seed from the Merri River Catchment Authority. That's the yam daisy. You can sometimes buy kangaroo grass seedlings, but don't just buy the ones that I'm talking about. Look at your own country. I'm the most overdressed man at the festival today, but that's because yesterday I was walking through, knee-high grass, searching for some of these old trees. But as I was searching for those old trees and respecting the changes that our old people wrought on those trees, the cultural symbols that they were building into those trees when they were little saplings, and those saplings are now 400, 500 years old. When I was doing that, I was walking through some of these grasses. They'll be on your land. If you look high and low, you'll find them on your land. So they're the ones to grow. Harvest your own grain, because that'll grow best there. It wants to grow there. It's trying to grow there. So I'm growing panicum. The only panicum I could get was from Queensland. And it's not what I wanted to grow, but it's what I'm growing. But the ideal solution is to find local grain, local Indigenous grain, and grow that. And really, the more we know about what the old people did, the more we will admire the diversity of their thought, because one of the sisters 2 years ago found some Aboriginal breads. I'd been looking for these breads, the old breads that have been taken out of the oven during the colonial period and then put into museums. Now, how you come by the bread straight from somebody's oven and you put it in a museum, that story, who took the bread, why, where was the baker, they're all very good questions. But anyway, I've been looking for those old breads that ended up in the museum, And when I did find them, thanks to one of my sisters, Kimberly Moulton from Melbourne Museum, one of them was made out of water lily seed. Water lily seed, who would have thought? The old people were ingenious and they were looking around country, and they weren't just growing monocultures. They weren't just growing monocultures of kangaroo grass. They weren't growing monocultures of yam. They were harvesting enormous varieties of foods and right across the botanical spectrum. And we should be trying to replicate those old foods, because when you see kangaroo grass, it won't be growing on its own. There'll be several other grasses there. When you see Bunurong in its original state, you'll see it growing with bulbi lily and orchids. You know, it's a diverse environment, diverse agricultural environment that we have to create. No more 1,000-acre plots of wheat. You know, we're going to have to look after the earth better than that, because 1,000-acre plots of wheat are just damaging the soil, but also very, very damaging for animals, which are reliant upon diversity.
Well, Unc, I'll tell you what, I can see it next year at Rainbow, that you invite those Aboriginal elders and those women, and we have a stall for them and a bakery selling your produce.
Well, I hope so, and we're close to it. It might be 1 year, it might be 2 years, it might be 3 years, but we are close to doing that. And I've been looking for the Aboriginal stalls here today, and I hope there's more here next year, because it's the Rainbow Serpent Festival, and at the Rainbow Serpent Festival, I was looking to see the serpent honoured, and because the serpent is the creator here of the country. So next year, the year after, whenever, I hope that you'll see young Aboriginal people, families who say, look, here's, try some of this bread. It came from grain that I grew on my ground.
Oh, that's beautiful, Unc. Yeah, well, you know, this here beautiful gathering, I can proudly say I've been involved with Rainbow for 13 years, and I hope many more, Unc. And if I may, people, you know, this is for me an amazing journey to have seen this transformation, worked with you all, but also knowing we have got an audience that reach the world over, who are like-minded, who are passionate, who are listening, and that's evidenced by here just today. There's 20,000 people who come to this festival, and I hope that we can have more of you here and your knowledge in whatever way that presents. We're just going to have a couple more questions. We're doing good time, so you're next.
Hello.
Just introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Emily, and thank you so much for sharing with us today. Your story is so fascinating, and your book is fascinating as well. And I think it seems your findings have come as a shock to a lot of people, because we never got taught that, and we've been brought up on a lie. And what I want to ask is, how would you suggest we incorporate your book and your findings and this part of history into the education system so everyone can know about it?
Well, the information in the book has always been there. Sadly, it has always been there. And that information came to me from the ground, from the earth. So it was no great intellectual achievement. The information was already there. It came out of the ground. And Mugabala Books, a very small publishing company in Western Australia, who published Dark Emu after 3 other Australian publishers, including Penguin, knocked it back, deserve a lot of the credit. But also they deserve the credit because in April of this year, they're producing a school's version of Dark Emu called... So our young people whether they be Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, will be learning about these things in school this coming year. And, you know, it's not just non-Aboriginal people have to know these things, it is Aboriginal people too. And it is no one's fault. Ignorance is no one's fault, but it is our responsibility, because you can relieve ignorance. And our own people, I want our own young people who are harming themselves in such terrible ways so often, need to be supported by pride. And that we can give our people pride by telling the old people's story. Did you know, you 11-year-old boy, who the only thing you want to do is play football? Do you know that your people invented bread? Across the whole landscape of the earth and all those cultures, your people invented bread. And did you know, you 14-year-old girl who's finding school so difficult at the moment and wondering who you are as a person, not just as an Aboriginal person, but as a person, did you know that your people invented peace? Live with that. And we can all live with that, because it is the culture of the earth here. And we live here. We drink our water here. We eat our food here. We go to sleep here. We wake up here. It is our culture, and it is our culture of peace.
Well, Unc, I just want to share a little bit of a story with you. As I said, I've been coming to Rainbow now for 13 years. And it's actually, for me, it's a migration. I come from New South Wales, Sydney, as you know, Gadigal country. And so I make the time and I drive, and I do it for many reasons. But on the way home, I've got the radio on, and I'm hearing this man, Bruce Pascoe, talking about dark emu, what you've just all heard now. And this is going back, how old's the book now, Unc? 2014. Well, you got to forgive me, because I got, you know that koala that you mentioned about the little tiny brain? Well, that's I'm not far off that, right? But I thought to myself, I got to meet this man. And I cannot believe that I'm actually sitting up here sharing a stage with you, Unc. So you've taken my breath away.
Just the earth, bros.
You are opening all our minds to far more than just the concept of agriculture. And that's what I want us to understand. We all have a role and responsibility, and I think what we're starting to see here is what are our opportunities with his brother here, looking at farming solutions. But you know, sometimes there is an opportunity straight away through your local government, through your state government, to start turning up the conversation. Start asking the questions and demanding. And I think that's what Uncle Bruce is trying to do in a sense. This is the gift. He's just pulling back. You know what Michelangelo said? I saw the angel in the marble and I carved until I set him free. And that concept, I think, is what Dark Emu's done. Someone can't do everything, but everyone can do something. So I hope we can take some of that message away. We do have more time here, ladies and gentlemen, so are there any more questions that you want to ask Uncle Bruce? We got any more? Okay, lovely. We'll come to you, brother. Yep. Nice and loud, and introduce yourself there, brother.
Thanks so much for all your wisdom that you've shared. My name's Steph. I've travelled down from Ginnabarra country in Brisbane. I was born on Larraquito land, but my bloodline is Greek and Italian and Irish and English. And you touched on it earlier with your introduction for Uncle, when you talked about cultural lenses. And I'd really love to hear much more about the process of decolonisation. Please, can you put some more voice to that?
Well, decolonising the world is difficult. There was a United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights about 7 or 8 years ago. In all of the world, there are only 4 countries didn't sign that declaration. One was Australia, another was New Zealand, Canada was the 3rd, and I can't remember the 4th, but it doesn't matter.
America.
I saw the name Australia there, and I was deeply ashamed that this country could not see fit to sign rights on behalf of Indigenous peoples. And that's a colonial hangover. Australia's not in a post-colonial state. We are still colonial. And so we have to decolonise those institutions so that when people sit down as representatives of our government and argue against the United Nations that Indigenous people should have rights, we don't want to be that country anymore. We don't want to see the name Australia there. We want to be with Cambodia. We want to be with Sri Lanka. We want to be with India and China. They all signed that document. We want to be with those people who see that Indigenous people have rights, not total rights, but just normal human rights. Not exclusive rights, just normal human rights. And, you know, we talked about food before. The one thing Aboriginal people haven't got is land. And we talked about land before, and that offer to restore land. And I get that offer coming through a lot because a lot of Australians are genuine in wanting to do something on behalf of their land and on behalf of the First Nation people. But this is an opportunity for governments to put their money where their mouth is and say that we have reserved forest land, which we're growing blue gum on. And you know what happened in Tasmania and Western Australia when they discovered that they weren't getting a second generation of blue gum growth? They poisoned the plantation from the air. Because it wasn't doing what they'd wanted to do, they sprayed it from the air with poison to kill it. Just think about it for a moment, that you try to get the earth to do something for you that it doesn't want to do, and then when it doesn't do it, you punish the earth. It was your mistake. You know, so we need to be more gentle. And I have to congratulate you on your headgear in the Richmond colours. I didn't know you cared. So that's wonderful.
All right, I think we got one more question up here, yeah? Yeah, we're just coming with the mic. Just introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind, nice and close, thanks.
Hello, I'm Jono. Nice to meet you, Uncle Bruce. I am a school teacher, and I brought your work into the classroom, Bruce, and the children had a very positive response to your work. So I was very interested in hearing what you have to say. I'm very inspired, and so thank you very much for your work. And it is being worked into education now, speaking from personal experience. The second thing, we came across a story of Burke and Wills up at the Dig Tree, and one of the stories is that they were approached by, I believe it's called the Yakandanda people, who offered them Nardu, which was also a bread substance. And when John King, as the sole survivor of that expedition, was taken in by the Yakandanda and given Nardu, I just wonder if you had some information about Nardu. Is Nardu still being grown? Because I understand it's also an Indigenous bread.
Yeah, Nardu is a wonderful plant, perfectly suited to dry country Australia. Once the lake is dry or the watercourse is dry where the Nardu is growing, it'll drop its seed and it can be swept up. It is the simplest agricultural system you can imagine. But like a lot of seeds, it has to be treated. And like any chef knows, there are foods which need preparation. And with Nardu, has to be soaked. Soaked in water. And because I think it's has a lot of oxalic acid in it, has to be leached out. I might be wrong with whatever it is, but it's a leaching process. Many Australian foods had to be treated in that way, like pandanus palm, things like that. There was a way of treating them which the old people knew, and Burke was actually told by that mob how to eat it, and instead of that, he shot at them with his pistol. And you know, there's nothing more likely to deter the advice from a chef than being shot at, and so they didn't get much information. To Burke's credit, he was probably hallucinating at the time, and you know, he was in terrible straits. He was. I don't think Burke was a bad man, but he was an idiot. He was a complete idiot, and we revere this man. Wills stuck by him and died as a result. Burke wasn't a bad man, but he was an idiot. You know, he didn't know how to conduct himself as a social man, and he certainly disrespected Aboriginal people. The reason that King survived was he watched what Aboriginal people did with their food, and he did the same. And he respected the fact that they were looking after him. That's why King survived. That's the story that doesn't get told. We all, you know, get on a King's tour, ironic name that it's King's bus lines that take that tour to the Dig Tree, and we revere the Dig Tree. You learn nothing on those tours about the people who tried to save Burke's life.
Yeah, I've heard they're going to rename that the Nardu plant. You know, we always say nah, yeah, and yeah, nah. That's a little Aussie joke for our international guests. I'm sure you'll understand what I said. Yeah. You know what? We say yeah, nah, which means yes, and we say nah, yeah, which means no, right? So, Unc, I just wanted to ask you one last question. We've got 5 minutes, and I hope this isn't going to be a heavy one. But you know, in New Zealand, our brothers over there, the longest court case in history, I'll have you know, folks, 170 years. And as Unc said, you can Google this. And I'm going to try and get the pronunciation correct, and I do my best. So I think it's the Whanganui River. And it has... Whanganui. Thank you. Who said that? Hand up. Thank you, brother. Jeez, he's covered up too. Look at the headdresses now. I told you, it's Whanganui, the man with no face. Whanganui. Okay, so just a quick snapshot. Again, 170 year through the Western court system. There was a transaction, and I'm drawing this from memory, as I said, koala brain. I think it was about $80 million transaction from the government after this amount of time to recognise and now give legal rights to this river. That river has more rights than First Australians here, yeah? So again, just some perspective. So one of the things I'd like to share with you is, you know, there needs to be a voice, an Indigenous voice. Unc mentioned it earlier, the Uluru Statement from the heart. We need all of you. I sat in another talk with Unc here in museum in Sydney, and a lady asked, and I know her intentions were right, how do we preserve Aboriginal culture? And I had a bit of a chuckle here with Unc. I said, well, fight for the rights of Aboriginal people. We're the ones who preserve our culture. Don't stick it in a museum. Bring it out into life, agriculture. So we need that support at every level of government. We need to provide and cultivate the space, I'm going to use that term, cultivate the space for the next generation to have an economic baseline, but also to have a political voice. So we need to inspire them to want to get into government, but also they need to remember their cultural contract with their ancestors. So, Unc, I just wanted to ask you in 3 minutes what you think about that concept of the River Whanganui.
Well, I don't know much about that river. and it's not my country to have an opinion about, but the Murray-Darling Basin, there is a debate going on in government at the moment about what to do with the environmental flow, which is supposed to be for the birds and plants and fish of the Murray-Darling Basin. And because we're in drought conditions, very severe drought, affecting a lot of farmers, the right wing of that debate are saying that the environmental flow should go to the farmers. And I think this is a debate we need to get involved in, not sit back and listen to it happening, but get involved in it and say, well, actually the rights of the river are important, because the funny thing about rivers is they get their name because they have water flowing in them. And when you have a river that doesn't have water, and it's no longer a river, it's just a ditch. And so the Murray-Darling Basin that used to transport wool from Burke down to Melbourne along that river system, no longer, you can't paddle a canoe on most of it. So the river needs its rights protected. And one of the rights is rivers have water. You know, only 3 words. Politicians will understand what you're talking about because it doesn't go for long. Rivers have water. So just Google your local member's name, particularly the ones that are along the Murray-Darling Basin, and just remind them that rivers have water. And if we're growing cotton, and that is the reason why those rivers don't have water, that is the reason why those towns don't have water, that is the reason why the small battling farmer doesn't have water, because some billionaire is growing cotton in a country that shouldn't be growing it, and he's only growing cotton because he's getting a subsidy from the Australian government, then we have to look at our water use. And we have to look at the towns that don't have water. We have to look at the blue-green algae that is killing stock and fish. The fish kill that's going on in the Darling River at the moment is attributable not to global warming, it's attributable to the fact that that river does not have water. So ring up your local politician around about 3 o'clock in the morning and say, rivers have water. It's not a threatening statement.
Well, I'm still pinching myself, fellow Rainbowites, that I'm actually sharing a stage with Uncle Bruce, and that I'm in your presence. And I hope that you feel the same. And I think just by your attendance, that message is coming loud and clear. Uncle Bruce, from me, you are amazing. I hope that we can have an ongoing conversation here at Rainbow and have some sort of honorary status for you. The knowledge, the message, your presence. Someone was asking me, what does he look like? I said, well, he looks like Jesus. And I mean that with all due respect. Well,
my brother, excuse me for interrupting, but you're going to have to stop that because this is not about individuals. The people who decided on a culture that would have no war, where everyone would get fed, where everyone would have a house, where everybody would take part in the culture. They weren't doing it on their own. They were doing it with their own people. I've always done it with my own people, and I'm bloody proud to. And so if anyone is to blame, it is those old people. And if any individual is to blame for my ability to say these things, it is my grandmother. Blame my grandmother, because she made me go to school. I wanted to play for Richmond. Thank you, my brother, for reminding me. And that's all I wanted to do. My grandmother said, Bruce, we have been poor all our lives. I am sick of it. This is an old lady in a wheelchair saying, I am sick of being poor. This is the end of it. The only way forward is education. You will get an education. You're not good enough at football to earn your living. Nah, she didn't say that. But she was right anyway. I was nowhere near good enough. And, that's just the luck of the draw. But don't talk about anything but the wisdom of those old people, because anything else is small fry compared to what the old people did.
Thank you, Unc. And ladies and gentlemen, just please, thank you. Big round of applause. The first time I've seen a standing ovation, Unc, so must thank you.